The Boise State Public Radio app. News, music, and more.
Idaho Matters.
Morning Edition.
All things considered.
The Connector.
And more.
And more.
You can take us wherever you go and stay connected. Without it, you're missing out. Download it free.
You can also communicate using the Talk to Us tab.
The Boise State Public Radio app.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. This is when we get you up to date on all the news that made headlines this last week. And today, our panel includes Caitlin Hart with EastIdahoNews.com, Clark Corbin with Idaho Capital Sun, and Kyle Funensteel, reporter for Idaho Capital Sun. I want to welcome all of you to the show. Happy Friday, everybody.
Happy Friday, Gemma.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
Well, we are going to begin, I feel like, as we've begun many Fridays in the last couple of months, with the legislature. And Clark, it has been difficult to keep up with all of the bills that have been introduced this session. And you have written that there is a very good reason why. It is because they have introduced the highest number of bills this session than in the last 5 years. Can you tell us about this? And then what are some Republicans trying to do about all of this?
Yeah, for sure, Gemma. You and I aren't the only ones, right, that have our hands full trying to keep track of what's going on at the Idaho State Capitol building in Boise. But you're exactly right. The Idaho Legislative Services Office, a nonpartisan group of staffers working with legislators, they track these kinds of things when we talk about the number of bills drafted and introduced. And they actually publish each week kind of a running total of how we're doing. And so we can go back to the 2020 session and look at each year. And what they found is that this year, through the end of the first 10 weeks in the legislative session here, they've prepared 890 pieces of legislation this year.
Wow.
And to put that in context, if you go back just 2 years ago to 2023, the number was 793. So that's a bump of almost 100 additional pieces of legislation, essentially 100 more bills that we're seeing this year compared to what we were just a couple of years ago. It's really taken off the last 2 years, Gemma. 2020, 2021, 2022, we were seeing 775 bills, 794 bills, 784 bills, 793 bills, and then a huge jump last year, and then a jump again this year to 890. And even though we're very late in the legislative session, as a matter of fact, today was the day that legislators picked before the session that they hoped to adjourn. And that's actually not going to happen because the budget isn't set. But we're late in the session and bills keep getting introduced. Gemma, we saw new bills introduced every day this week at the Idaho State Capitol. Wow. And so I know a lot of people are thinking that we're at the point where we would wind down the session, but the bills just keep coming. And I can talk a little bit more about what's going on. But the first person I talked to about the increase in bills that we're seeing was House Minority Leader Ilana Rubel. She's a Boise Democrat, and she's been in the legislature for 11 years, and she's noticed a huge shift in terms of the increase of the number of bills that we're seeing. And she actually blamed it on a concept that we've talked about a couple of times over the years on Idaho Matters. But it's this idea, Gemma, of form legislation or template legislation. It's essentially these out-of-state interest groups develop kind of boilerplate, cookie-cutter template legislation that have made it so that if you just change a couple of words to localize a bill to your state, you can essentially take these templates and drop them off at state capitol buildings all across the country and introduce the same bill in different states and just change one or two words to make it an Idaho-specific bill. Representative Rubel said she's very concerned about that it used to be that most of the bills were developed by either state agencies here in Idaho or state legislators here in Idaho who would notice a problem among their constituents or an issue in their neighborhood that they wanted to work on. But instead, what we're seeing more and more, according to Representative Rubel, is legislators going to these out-of-state conferences or think tanks and walking home with just a stack of template legislation that was developed by somebody else who's not in Idaho, and these bills can be tailored to be introduced in Idaho very quickly, just by adding the words Idaho in some cases. And so what is there to be done about this? Some legislators are pushing a bill, House Bill 378, which passed the House last week. And what that is seeking to do is create an optional self-disclosure process, asking legislators to disclose any out-of-state travel that they participate in for government or legislative reasons, but they do not pay for themselves. It would be a voluntary program under House Bill 378. It passed the House, but some Republican legislators, including Representative Stephanie Mickelson from Idaho Falls, are pushing this as a way to hopefully create a little bit more transparency about who's paying for some of these trips and maybe who's responsible for some of this template legislation, some of these out-of-state bills that we're seeing. Now, that's not to say that every bill we're seeing this year is coming from this form legislation or template legislation. But Representative Rubel is confident that she's seen an increase of it. And we have some examples real quick that I can talk about. But when we talk about bills that block transgender athletes from participating in women's sports, when we talk about an immigration bill in Idaho, like House Bill 83, that was modeled after a Texas-style immigration law that's being challenged in the courts, as well as bills that are put in place to put restrictions on Medicaid and Medicaid expansion. Those are three examples of what I'm talking about with this kind of form legislation, this template legislation, where very similar bills are popping up in state capitals all across the country, Gemma.
I was going to say, Clark, this is not unique to Idaho, but I really think what it does is points out kind of what these think tanks are doing, right? And pushing very specific agendas across the country by creating these bills and then pushing these into these state legislatures.
Yep. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. When we talk about these out-of-state bills, that's the concern, frankly, among Democrats and some Republicans as well. So we'll watch as we move forward towards the hopefully end of the legislative session. We'll watch that House Bill 378, which is just trying to add that little bit extra disclosure, particularly around trips that legislators take that they do not pay for themselves. So I know we'll continue to follow it and report back, Gemma.
All right. Appreciate that update, Clark. So I want to dig into some of these bills. And Kyle, you will be joining us again on Monday to really go in depth about the Medicaid bill the governor just signed. But before we do that, for folks who are listening today, can you just give us a brief high-level overview?
Yeah, so the governor earlier this week signed a big Medicaid bill that proposes a bunch of significant policy changes in hopes of saving costs on the Medicaid program, which has grown a lot in its proportion of taking up the state budget over the last few years. And it's a long bill. It does a lot. It's very complicated policy. But I'll try to stick to like the two biggest things that stick out to me is first, Idaho is going to again try to get work requirements for Medicaid. This is going to just be for able-bodied people on Medicaid. That's the big thing that caught a lot of pushback in this bill because many critics say that Medicaid work requirements are just red tape. Most people on Medicaid are already working, and now they just have to go prove that to the state. But the other big thing that I'm really focused on is Idaho will try to privatize Medicaid management. This process is usually called managed care, and it's used by the vast majority of states for Medicaid program. It's essentially where, right now in Idaho we have kind of a mix of all these different Medicaid management structures. Some are managed by the state, some are managed by private companies, some are even managed by doctors' offices. So, but under managed care, which Idaho is going to try to shift to, instead of dealing with the state health department, people who are on Medicaid, if they want to request to go to a doctor's office for a visit or other benefits, they're dealing with a private company, and they're the ones who approve your care and manage your benefits.
Okay, well, I appreciate that update. And like I mentioned, Kyle will be joining us on Monday, and we will really go in depth on what this means. So be sure to join us on Monday for that. Caitlin, let me bring you into the conversation. So Senator Mike Crapo was part of a forum for the Boise Metro Chamber of Commerce earlier this week. It had a $50 per person price tag to attend. So hundreds of people showed up outside of this event protesting him. And after that event, local media in Boise tried to speak to the senator as he was walking out. His staff told media he didn't have time to speak. I say all of this because he did have time to speak to your news organization. He stopped by East Idaho News this week and spoke with your Nate Eaton. So what were the highlights of this conversation?
Right. Yeah, we found him. We got him into the newsroom and for anybody looking for him. So there were a lot of highlights. We actually ended up bringing Mike Simpson in yesterday too, and Nate spoke with him as well. But as for the Senator Crapo interview, it was really interesting because kind of backing off the topic you were just going on is my news director, Nate, actually asked him if he's planning on holding any public town halls because of what he told constituents outside. And he said that he worries that they just become rallies to attack President Trump. He said he's done over 200 town halls over the last decade in Idaho. And he hasn't done very many recently, but he did say that he's available on social media and over, phone and technology, and that way. And he did say that those that are protesting have full access to him in his office. But the baseline of that was kind of that both Senator Crapo and Senator Simpson said, or Representative Simpson said that they believe that these town halls end up being more of a political rally. When Nate talked to Senator Simpson, or oh my gosh, Representative Simpson, he said that he doesn't have any town halls scheduled right now, but he'll see in the future when he gets home. And then he said, quote, I've seen some town halls and talked to some people that have had them, and they've been infiltrated by people from even outside the district and everything else that's set up. If people are there to discuss an issue, I think that's fine. But if you're just there to yell and throw signs and all that stuff, then they're not really helpful. They're just kind of a media show. So it kind of shows that both of them are kind of on the same page about that. And Senator Crapo said he's just not inclined to offer them at a forum where he believes it will end up just being kind of like a political attack rally, is kind of what he got to. But some of the other interesting parts of that interview came from their discussion on the first 2 months of President Trump's administration. Senator Crapo says that he thinks the first 2 months are going well. And basically that he said, I think everyone in America knows the fight is on. He talked about the Department of Government Efficiency and that he supports what they're doing. He basically just kind of talked about that President Trump's team is in place and he likes what they've been doing. He also mentioned something that's kind of close to the Idaho Falls people's hearts here, the Idaho National Laboratory. People around here have been concerned that the DOGE federal employee cuts are going to trickle down into employees at Idaho National Laboratory because they take federal funding. And my coworker Nate asked if it's going to affect the INL, and he said it definitely will. He said Idaho participates in most, if not all, of the federal programs, whether it's housing programs, food stamp programs, Medicaid, Medicare, everything. And he said that Idaho citizens are going to see a benefit from it, but that it will definitely trickle down, and we'll see some of that DOGE cuts coming to Idaho National Laboratory, it sounds like.
Okay, well, I really appreciate that update, Caitlin. And for people who are interested, we will, of course, put links on our website, but you can always go to eastidahonews.com. They have the full interview on their website. There's video. So I encourage everybody to see what the senator has to say along with Representative Simpson, because that interview is there as well. It is important that at least they are taking time to talk with one media outlet and we can hear what they have to say. So, Clark, you have written an in-depth series about the powerful JFAC committee and some of the issues that it's been facing this session, which frankly is holding up the legislature from ending the session. I know this can get into the weeds. So can you give us the Cliff Notes version, or as my 16-year-old has told me, the kids these days use Spark Notes version of what's been going on?
Yeah, for sure. Happy to talk about it. Just a little bit of background here, Jim. I've covered the Idaho legislature every session since 2011. And for decades, JFAC worked together and voted together under processes that were kind of nationally recognized. And over the last 2-3 years, leadership in the House and the co-chairs of JFAC have made some changes. And so right now, what I've kind of uncovered in my reporting the last few weeks is that there's a lot of confusion and uncertainty over how exactly voting works in JFAC. And I've also documented that there's kind of two different standards for how voting works within the Budget Committee. And I can kind of get into it, but I want to pause for just a second and talk about what JFAC is and why it's so important. And then we can talk a little bit about this uncertainty and these delays in the legislative session. But JFAC is the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee. It's this powerful committee that meets almost every day during the legislative session, Jim. And JFAC is responsible for setting every state budget for every state department and agency. And so whether we're talking about money for public schools or pay for police, for Idaho State police troopers, or money to keep up our state parks, money to pay for judges, money to pay for our legal system, JFAC has to sign off on everything. And so why is this important? Well, the Idaho Constitution really only has one requirement for Idaho legislators, and that's to set a balanced budget every year. That hasn't happened yet. And that's the reason that the legislature hasn't been able to adjourn for the year today like they would like to. There've been a series of issues with JFAC related to these budget changes. And I've talked to House leadership. I've talked to House Speaker Mike Moyle. I've talked to the JFAC co-chairs, Representative Wendy Horman and Senator Scott Grow. They've told me that the changes that they created were designed to increase transparency and make sure that there's more buy-in at the committee level before these budgets advance to the full House. But what's actually happened is there's more confusion in JFAC over how voting works than in any other committee in the Idaho legislature this year. And that's because JFAC is a little bit different. There's members of the Idaho Senate on JFAC, and there's members of the Idaho House on JFAC. That's a little unusual. Normally, it's just members of one chamber or the other, like the House Education Committee, right? That's all House members. But JFAC actually has 10 senators and 10 House members. And what I found out is that there aren't any published rules governing how JFAC works. And so that's a little bit confusing just on itself, that there aren't any joint rules published that govern how JFAC works, whereas the Idaho Senate has adopted the joint rules. So there's sort of like no published rules to refer back to. And then when it comes to voting, the 10 senators disagree with the 10 House members on what it takes to pass a budget out of JFAC. And so that's really kind of the heart of it, is that depending on what the 10 senators do or the 10 House members do, it could be treated differently. And why this matters is because JFAC is a more conservative committee than it was a few years ago. And so it's easier than ever to kill budgets under these new rules. There's uncertainty over how voting works. And there's so much uncertainty that even the other day, the actual co-chairs of JFAC made a mistake with handling the voting. There was a vote that failed among the House members, and they attempted to send that bill to the House, even though the House clerk has been very clear, saying if it fails, if it doesn't get a majority, we don't have any kind of mechanism to bring that forward. So the big picture things to keep in mind are JFAC is arguably the most important committee in the entire legislature. because it really controls the budget, the power of the purse, the power of spending. And there's been major changes to how JFAC operates. And there's two different interpretations of what happens with the voting. And so that creates a lot of uncertainty when we're talking about what are we going to do with some of these large divisive budgets that haven't been set, that are delaying the end of the legislative session. I think I've done 5 articles over the last 2 weeks about delays in setting the revenue target that the budget was built around. I came on this show several weeks ago and talk about delays in setting the raises for state employees. And all that is kind of caught up to JFAC. And now there's delays in getting the final budget set, which is delaying the overall legislature from going home. It does get a little technical, but if you want some more details, there's a number of stories that I've written that are available on the Idaho Capital Sun's website that kind of walk through how JFAC used to work and just kind of the nuts and bolts of these different interpretations of the voting procedures. It's a lot to get into, but I do appreciate a couple of minutes to highlight it because when we talk about money for any of these programs in the state and deciding what the appropriate levels of funding are, JFAC is the one that has to take the lead on making those decisions. And there's even division among JFAC members. Some JFAC members like the changes. Some JFAC members are struggling with the changes and say that they don't understand really what it takes to pass a motion to advance a budget, which is a very kind of fundamental, basic level function of a committee. I have talked to the co-chairs and they said they're trying to provide certainty. They have agreements in place, but the House disagrees with the Senate. And so we may see some changes when the legislature adjourns before coming back next year to this overall process. But I understand it's a little confusing. It's confusing to me, and that's why I've chosen to write about it, is because as someone who goes every day, I had a hard time understanding what the standard was to advance a bill or pass a motion, and just knowing the importance of that committee. I wanted to write about some of the things that I didn't understand, and that's kind of how we got here. But I appreciate a couple of minutes to kind of go through what's going on with that budget committee and why we haven't been able to adjourn the session like legislative leaders hoped, Gemma.
Well, I appreciate the update, Clark, and I would really encourage everyone, go to the Idaho Capital Sun and read those 5 articles that Clark wrote about. It is really important about how this works and for people to understand it. With that said, Kyle, a lot of folks have been waiting to see if the Idaho legislature would do anything in regards to our state's strict abortion ban, if they would do anything this session. So has there been any movement?
In short, not really. Idaho Republicans are taking a sort of wait and see approach. That's pretty much the same thing they've done for the past 2 years since Idaho's near total abortion bans have been in place. They want to see how lawsuits challenging the bans resolve in court and try to see what the courts will say about how Idaho's laws work and if they need any more clarity. And some Republicans also say, I talked to Representative Brent Crane. He chairs the House State Affairs Committee. That's the committee that usually handles abortion legislation in the House. And he says Idaho abortion bans are clear and they give doctors discretion. On the other hand, many doctors have repeatedly asked over the years for an exception to protect mothers' health, not just their life, which is what's outlined in Idaho's law.
So, Kyle, with that said, tell us about Senate Bill 1171 and how this could impact unfounded lawsuits against doctors in regards to abortion.
Yeah, so just to back up, Idaho has several abortion bans in place. This bill would be a minor change to Idaho's civil abortion ban, which lets people sue doctors over abortions. The bill would basically lay out a process for judges to dismiss lawsuits that don't have much legal ground.
And so, Kyle, the bill is now headed to the Senate for amendments. Can you explain to us what that actually means?
Yeah, so it did get amended on the Senate floor this morning, just like half an hour ago. I don't know what all changed in it, but I heard that before the amendments that they would mostly be technical and that the bill still wouldn't really change the spirit of Idaho's abortion bans, kind of clarifying the conditions under which lawsuits can be dismissed and stuff like that. It's modeled after a recent anti-SLAPP law that Idaho passed to let judges like quickly dismiss frivolous lawsuits.
Okay, appreciate that update. And tell us about a recent decision by the Idaho Supreme Court that ends a nearly 8-year-long legal battle between an Idaho Falls woman and a medical debt collection company.
Right. So, essentially, a medical debt company in Idaho Falls called Medical Recovery Services is represented, well, it's represented by Brian Smith and Brian Zolliger of Smith, Driscoll and Associates. And the debt collection service was ordered to pay $127,000 in legal fees after the Idaho Supreme Court found that they wrongfully sued a local woman over a $460 hospital bill.
Mm.
The story is actually pretty interesting, I think. So essentially, this woman was admitted to the ER at Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center in Idaho Falls in 2017. She tried to give the receptionist her insurance information, but she was told it would be collected after she was screened. This woman actually worked in medical billing, so she knew the process and knew that the hospital needed her information to charge her insurance. Um, and then the doctor told her that she needed a colonoscopy and an endoscopy immediately. So while she was being prepared for these surgeries or procedures, her husband says he gave his wife's insurance card to the emergency room registrar. The next morning, the patient again called her insurance administrator to tell them she was admitted to the hospital and asked a nurse how she could get her insurance information to the hospital because she wasn't sure that the hospital had received it from her husband. Um, the nurse ended up giving this woman a phone number for the ER registrar. She called and they didn't answer, so she left a voicemail. And when the hospital called her back, she again gave them her insurance details. Ermac's records show that the insurance information was on the patient's file 2 days before she was admitted to the emergency room. A week after she was discharged, the lady called the hospital to make sure that the insurance information was correct, and she was told that it was. Um, so essentially, Ermac, Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center, they contract with Intermountain Emergency Physicians, which is a group of doctors that provide services in the emergency room. And they send its own bills for services, but they rely on the hospital to gather insurance information and share it with them. So the insurance companies and patients can be charged correctly. Um, and even though Ermac had this woman's current insurance information, IEP had old data from a 2014 ER visit that she had gone to. So IEP actually submitted the new claim to the old insurance company, and it was denied because this woman no longer had that coverage. 3 months after that emergency room visit, IEP turned the patient's bill over to Medical Recovery Services, the debt collection agency. The patient and Ermac were never contacted even about this, even though they had the woman's phone number and everything. And all of her medical bills from the visit would have been covered by her insurance company except for IEPs. Medical Recovery Services said they mailed the patient 10 notices between August 2018 and June 19th. And this is where it takes kind of like a weird turn because the first thing they mailed her was returned undeliverable, and the woman said she never received the other notices. They found out that there was actually a person on probation that had been stealing her mail, so she never got them. So it's just kind of twists and turns throughout the whole thing. She ended up being sued for $2,500 for a $480 attorney fee. But like I said, the Medical Recovery Services is ending up having to pay her because they just found that they wrongfully sued her because there were so many chances for them to get the correct insurance information, and they never were able to.
Wow. A lot to take in there, but I thought it was fascinating. Okay, I have only got 2 minutes left. Clark, I think it's important to quickly talk about this settlement with Idaho Power. It has agreed to in regards to the Valley Fire, which happened in East Boise in October. So do this in 2 minutes or less.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Jim. And we'll get through it quickly so we can wrap up. But yeah, I think A lot of Boise residents remember waking up October 4th and seeing the foothills on fire. That was the Valley Fire was the name of it, and it actually burned almost 10,000 acres in the Boise foothills, including a part of the Boise River Wildlife Management Area, which is an important winter habitat for deer and elk. Basically, these deer and elk that live in the Sawtooth Mountains in the summer, they're coming down into the foothills above the Boise River in the winter. And this fire was found to be started by a power line that was touching the ground. I came across some budget documents yesterday that showed that Idaho Power has agreed in principle, subject to like some final legal terms, to pay the state an $800,000 settlement to help restore habitat that was burned in the Boise River Wildlife Management Area. We're talking about removing invasive grasses, reseeding, taking out hazardous trees, and basically restoring the area for public use. The Idaho Department of Fish and Game is going to accept the money and begin spending it to restore that part of the foothills, that winter habitat that was burned. And they say it's such an important winter habitat because with all the development and the building going on in the foothills, the wildlife area is a place where they can be protected in the winter. And so there's a settlement agreement in principle subject to finalizing the final legal terms, but it does look like Idaho Power is going to be paying the state $800,000 to restore the burned area and get it ready for public use and to serve again as a critical winter range habitat for more than 300 species of animals, but most prominently deer and elk, Gemma.
Well, I appreciate that update, Clark, and I appreciate all of you for joining us today. We've been speaking with Caitlin Hart with EastIdahoNews.com, Clark Corbin with Idaho Capital Sun, and Kyle Fonenstiel, reporter for Idaho Capital Sun. And remember, folks, follow all of them. Check out their reporting. We are lucky to have the journalists that we do here in Idaho. You've been listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. I'm Gemma Gaudet.